Hello everybody, I am Ben from Team Panic. It is now time to talk about how mistakes were. My multi-bot that is not now a multi-bot performed at Robowars Featherweight Sportsman for April. This was a really good fun event, but before we jump in, I need to give a few acknowledgements. First of all, thanks to Nick from Team Hustle, who provided the footage that you saw right at the very open there. He put a camera inside his robot Nexus, and during a fight with Mistakes Were Here, provided that awesome footage, and we'll get back to that fight in a little bit. I have left his Facebook page in the description down below. Check him out. He put his camera in for the full fight. I didn't show that here. I think he's going to put the entire footage on his Facebook page. If not, I will talk to him and we'll sort something out, because it is very cool to see that kind of in-the-box experience like that. My second acknowledgement here is James from Team Blue-Green, who not only provided some of the footage from some of these fights you're about to see, but also Mistakes Were was very underweight here. It wasn't supposed to be there. It's supposed to be a multi-bot. And with weapon locks on, it was 10 kilos. So I put out the call, anybody who was from the area, who had a beetle weight and didn't mind putting it in the arena with some featherweights, please help out and add to my very underweight robot. And James very kindly offered his beetle as a sacrifice, almost. He also went through and added some extra armor to it and made it the sportsman legal. He did a decent amount of work on this beetle weight to put it into the arena against much heavier robots. So a big thank you to him. I mean, even though he put extra armor and stuff on, much like me putting extra armor and stuff on, it made very slight difference. He went up to a 1.5 kilo beetle, so the two robots together with their weapon locks on was 12 kilos, which is still very underweight for a featherweight event, but it was much better having him there than not having him there. So again, big thank you to him. And as with Nick, I have put a link to James's Facebook page in the description down below. Check both of those guys out. They're very cool. They helped out a lot over the weekend, and yeah, they're just nice guys. So we should jump on into some fights, and our first robot up is a robot called Volley. This robot apparently hadn't been fought for 5 years, and it is a 4-wheel drive kind of lifting mechanism. So that's not what you like to see at the start of a fight. Both of us had some kind of weird drive issue thing going. For my part with mistakes were, I was getting this kind of like weird steer where the left side of the robot seemed to take off faster than the right, which meant that I had to kind of feather my throttle because once I was driving straight, it was fine. It was just that initial kick that got everything kind of wrong, unfortunately. And that meant that trying to square up against him was very, very hard to do, which is a problem when I'm running such a thin little lifting arm on the front of the robot here. Talking about that, it was designed to be a flipper, however, it doesn't really flip a full 13 kilo robot, but it does lift, and that I was really, really, really happy to see. After this robot's first incarnation and first fights all the way back in January, and it just failing to do anything really with the weapon, I was so gratified to see that, yeah, I got Topple on it and lifted it, and they actually stayed in the air for a bit. I was like, yes! That is a win in my book. Look, after the absolutely rough kind of couple of weeks that I had trying to get a robot prepared for this event, the fact that this robot got into the arena and drove and lifted, I was ecstatic at that point. That was brilliant. I couldn't really have asked for much more. And I mean, look, we really didn't get much more. You probably saw a couple of times in there that the lifter was firing kind of consistently, and that was because, and like whiffing, because he was absolutely nowhere near me. This was me trying to reset the lift arm. At the moment, there's just a big old brushless motor on the back which spins to wind a rope to pull down. The problem with that is that to reset the lift arm, you just need to spin the motor in the opposite direction, and if you spin too far, it then just starts spooling the lift arm in the opposite direction. So trying to unspool the lift arm to get it to reset, if you go too far, it just fires again. And this motor is very quick and very, very powerful, so it doesn't take much to get the lift arm to refire if you're trying to unspool it. And this fight was a learning experience for that. So there's a lot of times in this fight that you see me just kind of like flick the lift arm a couple of times. That was literally attempting just to get it back to this state with the lift arm down and in the position to go after Volley and try and throw him around. I will also say here, James's Beetle did pretty well for the fact that it was a tiny little robot in a 13 kilo weight class. It took a couple of like drive shots, like Volley just driving straight into it and just kept going, which I was amazed about, even losing one of the outer wheels at one point and just kept driving. I mean, unfortunately, he had some electrical issues that stopped the drivetrain from working. There's a point where you can kind of see him stuck in a corner, wiggling his saw arm. He's not stuck on the floor, his drive system just kind of shorted itself out and died, or not shorted itself out, but just died in some way. And he wasn't really sure exactly what was happening with that, especially as he took the robot out of the arena, powered it off, powered it back on again, and it drove totally fine. So some weird little electrically gremlin in there somewhere. But of course, we need to talk about the mid and back half of that fight and the magic smoke. Yes. So partway through that fight, we started to smoke, and we started to smoke bad. I was really, really hoping that it was just a pulley that had burnt up and was like effectively letting off plastic smoke into the arena. And look, I was part right. I did indeed melt a pulley because the motor or the wheel let go and allowed the belt tension to slip just a little bit, which allowed that belt to wear out that pulley. I mean, that pulley was still kind of working because it was actually the only drive we had left on the right-hand side at the end of that fight. So all of the crab walking and stuff you saw right at the end there was being done on a mostly worn-out pulley, which that's incredible in my book. Yeah, because no, the smoke wasn't really from that. The smoke was from the fact that one of the motors burnt out entirely. Now, I'm not really sure yet because I haven't actually pulled the motor apart, but there is a short somewhere in there. It's either shorted right outside where some of this burn is, or it's shorted down deeper into the motor itself. I really don't know. I think it's because it was working really hard trying to play catch up with the other motor that was like speeding off ahead. But not only did it burn out the motor itself, it also burnt out the ground line on the signal cable for the ESC, which is a very, very unusual sight. I'm not really that accustomed to seeing this particular failure mode on an ESC. It was also a really, really, really bad thing because I only had one set of ESCs. I also only had one drive motor, or one set of drive motors, unfortunately. I do have spares of those. I took them to the last event. However, in this event, I was struggling for packed weight to take on my flight, and so I actually packed a lot of spares of the pulleys and did not pack the motors to save weight for the trip. Yeah. So unfortunately, I couldn't replace that motor. And even if I could have replaced that motor, I couldn't replace the ESC. So I basically had to scramble and change the robot over to just a front wheel drive. So the back wheels are still in here right now, but they are not connected to the motors, and the motors are not connected to ESCs. I mean, one of them is just burnt out entirely. Yes, I left the burnt out motor in there for weight reasons. I was like, well, I'm really, really underweight as it is. So, you know what, we should just keep this motor here because even the tiny amount of weight that it provides is going to help a little bit, maybe, I hope. Yeah. Anyway, so coming out of Fight 1, we're not in a great shape, really. I mean, the other thing that happened too is that the elastic snapped on the lifter, so there is an elastic in underneath the bottom here that does the lifter return. And I was just using a like hair tie thing for that. But unfortunately, it's not really up to the amount of force that exists in 13 kilo robots, and it snapped quite handedly. So I changed it over for some proper elastic for our next fight. So yes, I mean, the fight with Volley did go to the judges. However, having released a bunch of smoke, being not great on my drive, and also having a busted lift arm meant that I lost that judge's decision fairly handedly. Our next fight is up against a robot called Topple. This is another four-wheel drive lifting robot. However, it has a kind of sewer snake style lift and kind of like throw mechanism on the top of it. fight was an interesting fight. For me, the thing that stood out especially early on was that the lifter was doing a better job against Topple. I think Topple's geometry just helped out a little bit here. I was able to get in under his front lifter and get in deep enough that the actual throw of the weapon was doing something. I mean, it wasn't a flip that I wanted out of this design, but it was at least like lift and pop. Like, he got a little bit of air. Not a lot, definitely not a lot, but that is something we can improve for a version 2 of this. It's something I wanted to do for a version 2 of this, but it shows me I'm on the right track. This design has potential, and this fight, I think, proved it. I mean, in the early stages. In the later stages, it was very, very much the Topple show. I mean, at this point, as mentioned, we're on a 2-wheel drive system. I'm running 2 very small for the category motors. They are 28mm motors. And when I got the robot out of the arena here, those motors were very, very warm. They were working very, very hard in this fight because, yeah, they were going up against a drive system that was much, much, much stronger than them. So it's not all that surprising, really. And yes, that meant that Topple basically had most of the control of this fight. When I got in underneath him and got some pops off on him, like with the lift arm, I was able to control it a little bit, but he was a much faster, much more controlled, and much stronger drivetrain, so he kind of walked this fight a little bit. I will also say, so James's Beetle did a decent job in this fight. He, like I said, had got it out, had the electrical issue, tried to fix that, got it into the fight. He did get a cut on the back of Topple, but then unfortunately Topple and all of its drive power backed into him, and that electrical gremlin stuck him again. And so, yes, unfortunately the Beetle died for a second time, which again was a little bit unfortunate, but you know, these things happen when you put a Beetle weight in a featherweight arena. And then, yeah, as mentioned, it was basically the Topple show. He stacked me twice and let me back down again because he's a very, very nice person and wanted to keep the fight going. He also, when he charged me into that corner, I got air off of that. Like, there was a nice little pop up off of his kind of lifting arrangement there, which was very cool to see for somebody who is definitely a lifter and not really a flipper. To get some airtime out of a robot out of that was very, very cool. But then, of course, yeah, he finally did actually stack me right at the very end of the fight. Like, he stacked me with 12 seconds left, so the countdown was about 2 seconds out of the actual end of the fight. And look, he didn't need to have done that, really. Like, realistically, if it had gone to the judges, I was going to lose that fight anyway. Having said that, I was actually quite surprised at how well this performed. Despite having a very underpowered drive system, the drive survived pretty well for the entire fight, and the lifter mechanism only broke because of my own kind of I'm not, like, just, I made a bad decision. So as mentioned, I swapped from the kind of elastic hair tie to proper elastic. However, when I did that, I tied it off at the front properly, and then I tied a loop around a bolt in the back, which meant that when Topple jammed me so hard into the wall that the lift arm went all the way up, that released enough tension on the elastic to kind of pop that off the bolt that it was sitting on. And yeah, that meant that, you know, I lost the weapon in that particular case. And that was very silly because, as it was pointed out to me after this fight, I literally could have not tied the knot that way, looped it through the hole that the bolt went through in the chassis, and tied it off there. And I did that for the next set of fights, and I've not had any more problems with it. But it was that particular kind of mistake in setting up the weapon system that meant that, yes, I did lose the weapon in this fight. And of course, yeah, that made it even more the Topple show because I was running then 2-wheel drive with no weapon, and he was running 4-wheel drive, much more powerful than mine, and a weapon. So I was always kind of going to lose that particular fight. But again, very happy with how this is going, for how everything was leading up to this fight, or leading up to this event. Being able to go into the arena and basically last 3 minutes. I mean, yes, some of that was because Topple was a very nice guy and released me twice, but the robot survived all of that punishment. Like, I was still driving at the end of the fight, I was just upside down. So nothing broke, which is a good thing. That was way, way better than we did in January. Robowars works very similarly to the way that ARC does. There is a round robin group that you fight a couple of people in, and then based on that, you go on into the finals. So we were sitting on 2 losses, not a good start, and we were going up against James, the guy who has been fighting alongside us with his beta weight for the whole time, is now actually fighting us with his robot Gigablue. Now, earlier in the day, he had said that if that eventuality had occurred, he was going to pass the controller for his beta weight off to somebody else, and I would have the beta weight in the fight against him. However, the electrical issues that he had been facing in the first 2 fights had not gone away, and in fact were getting worse. And so he decided that he was just going to leave his beta weight out of this particular fight, which, you know what, fair enough. I totally get that. That was very, very fair. It was honestly amazing to me that he put his beta weight against featherweights in the first place, so I was just very glad to have had it for the first 2 fights. So anyway, we're going to move on to this fight against Gigablue. It is another 4-wheel drive lifter. This one is a very different to the first 2 styles, although the first 2 styles are very different. I think across the 3 of these, we've versed some very interesting and different 4-wheel drive lifters. So this was actually quite a fun fight. My lifter was mostly effective at throwing his lift up. His whole kind of wide scoop at the front was very, very hard for me to do anything about. And again, being that he was a four-wheel drive robot with much more drive power than me, it was very hard for me to do what I wanted to do, which was to get around the side of him and try and throw him around. He was very, very, very good at keeping his weapon squared up to me this entire fight, which of course meant that I had all sorts of trouble in this fight. And yeah, I could throw his lifter out of the way, but he could then bring it back down fairly easily. So there wasn't a whole lot I was actually able to do in this fight. However, the fun thing for me here was I had the anti-saw armor on. I mean, I ran the anti-saw armor all weekend just because, again, it was a little bit of extra weight. It meant that the robot was just that small amount heavier and therefore, I guess, a little harder to push around. But in this particular fight, because of the way the geometry of his lift arm works, my anti-saw armor was doing an amazing job at basically being like sprung self-righting plates, because he was stacking me on them in such a way that they bent, and then as they like released that energy, they just gave it enough push to kind of like, ooh, back onto the wheels. There was many of those in this fight, which was very funny to me, and very cool. That was not a design thing I had intended to have happen, but it worked. It was very fun. Yeah, and it wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if I had run the robot in this configuration without the anti-saw armor. I'm really certain that it was that anti-saw armor that made that work. Because again, like, not only was that kind of springy, but the whole robot is very low center of gravity, but it's very tall and very boxy. So it's hard to get that center of gravity over the tipping point, and that's what he was struggling with, which helped get me back on my wheels. Of course, good things don't last forever, and he did in the end manage to stack me sideways up against the wall. I did fire the lifter a number of times there trying to get back on my wheels. Unfortunately, I went fully the wrong way and ended up absolutely upside down, so he lost that fight. And so we've lost 3 fights in our round robin, but look, I'm very happy with those fights. All 3 of those fights I felt personally were a lot of fun to be in, and all 3 of those fights I didn't lose for hardware issues. I mean, I guess you can technically say that not having a self-righting mechanism is a hardware issue, but I didn't lose drive. I only lost the weapon because of the elastic, and I didn't lose the weapon in this final fight. That is a massive step up from where we were in January. In January, I was fighting every fight to keep my own drive system alive, and in this event, I was pushing people hard. I was running only on 2-wheel drive and still managing to have a drive system left at the end of the fight. Although I will say, in this fight, it was very interesting. The right-hand side was struggling yet again, and a couple of like throws of me into the wall somehow fixed that. There was some like percussive maintenance going on that somehow fixed the drive system, which was incredible. I'm not sure how that happened, but I do not knock that in any way, shape, or form. I will always take it when the drive system miraculously bursts to life again after being thrown into the wall repeatedly. That was always fun. Yeah, so that was the end of the round robin and the end of the first day of competition. We are obviously out of the finals. There is no way a robot with 3 losses is making it through into the finals. However, this being a featherweight event, people need a lot of time to repair robots as they go through and do the finals, which leaves things open for grudge matches and kind of whiteboardy style fights. So moving on through into day 2, we are just doing as many whiteboards as we possibly can. And our first one up is something completely different. We are fighting 2 robots, and both of them are kind of over-the-head style weapons. We've got a hammer and an axe in I Need a Bigger Hammer and Hatchet Job. Overnight, James had tried to get his beta weight back together again, had kind of tried to debug the electrical system. He put it into this fight against two very heavy hitting overhead weapons, and unfortunately it still died on him. He thinks that there's some kind of electrical connection gremlin in the drive system somewhere, and to fix it he would need to just redo the whole thing. So he put it into this one, but unfortunately did not put it into the next one because it basically just died on him again, so there wasn't a whole lot of point, unfortunately. Other than that, there's not really a lot I can say about this particular fight. It really was the hammer show, and most of that was because I kept getting stuck. So this robot is very low to the ground. The front armor actually does scrape a little bit, or like just off the front, mostly to try and keep the wheels a little bit protected. And unfortunately, during the weekend, the floor had got a bit beat up and kind of not flat anymore. And also the wheels that I'd been running, I had run them for 4 straight fights at this point. And if you look at this, you can see that I had lost probably a couple of mil of rubber on the diameter of each wheel. And that was more than enough to ground the robot out in the wrong spots on the floor. So we got stuck and basically just had to, well, I wasn't really watching the hammer fight, everybody else was, as I was trying desperately to get my robot unstuck. In reviewing the footage to watch this, I was watching the hammer fight, and they had a really great fight between the pair of them while I was stuck in the corner, or well, on the edge of the arena, effectively. Yeah, it was good fun to watch. But not much I can really say about it because I wasn't really involved. However, I will say right at the end there, that last time I got stuck, and I got stuck for the longest, I was doing everything I possibly could, and I was wiggling the wheels around all over the place and got a little bit of movement out of it, got stuck even worse. And then I tried to flip the arm, and that was doing very little. It took me a while to realize that I could pull the arm all the way down and keep the motor on. And what happened there is that the motor stalled out, but when it stalled out, it jittered. And that jitter got just enough like wobble in the robot to get it to off the stuck point and get me back into the fight, basically. Which was fun, but, you know, obviously, with the fact that that fight went to a judges, there was no way I was winning that, considering that I wasn't really even in the fight for a good third of it, I would say. At a brief estimation, it would be about a third. I was stuck on various points of the floor. So having said that, I was still pretty happy with this fight. Again, lasted a full 3 minutes, even on the 2-wheel drive, was actually still driving and running the weapon at the end. I also got a really good flip on I Need a Bigger Hammer there. I think that was kind of partly a timing thing. I fired my weapon and he fired or reversed his weapon basically around the same time, so I added a little bit of kinetic energy into that whole situation that throws his robot around anyway, and actually managed to get him upside down off of all of that. So again, this type of lifter I think can work. I just need a slightly different motor on it and slightly different gearing in the arm layout and everything, and I've got ideas for fixing that. So again, very happy with how this robot performed. I have lost all of my fights so far, but I have come out of each of these fights beaming because they have been fun fights and I have enjoyed all of them. There hasn't been a single one of these that I've come out of really disappointed or frustrated in the performance of my robot, which is what happened in some of the fights in January. So this is a step up in a big, big way, which is great. I love that. Now, the final fight for us for the weekend is another kind of whiteboardy, rumbly fight. This time up, we are up against Hack Slinging Slasher. Those of you who have been around on this channel and also on YouTube may recognize that as the name of Maker's Muse's robot. However, Angus is not driving the robot this time round. He has given it to a James, not the same James that we have been fighting with and against this weekend, a different James. And so he was fighting Hack Slinging Slasher for the weekend. We're also up against Nexus, Nick that I talked about right at the very start, who gave us the very cool footage from the very open of this video, who was also a table mate and just an all-around great guy. And we are also up against Clank, driven by Mark, who I think is a local from Brisbane, where we were fighting. Also, I'll say what those robots are. So Haxing Slasher is an overhead saw and a lifter all in one. Nexus is an undercutter saw, and Clank is an overhead axe weapon. So again, that was a fun fight, and we actually were like part of that fight this time, unlike the last one where we were stuck on the floor a lot. That is because I did change the wheels out, and with the wheels changed over to a fresh set of wheels. I mean, on the front, the back ones I just left because they're just free spinning. But with the front set of wheels on fresh wheels, we didn't get caught on the floor, at least not as badly as the last fight, so I will take that. Honestly. We also had a very cool hit with Nexus first up, which has done some very nice gourmet damage to the front of this lifting arm and made this lifting arm very cool. So I really like this now, especially with that tiny little face that I put on specifically for this fight. Clank got put upside down by Haxing Slasher. I'm just going to call that robot Slasher from here on out. It's very hard to say the whole thing all at once. Very early on in that fight, and unfortunately got stuck there. They should be able to self-right with their hammer, but their hammer mech had some kind of issue that meant that while they were in that position, they just could not fire it. It did come back later in the fight, as you saw when they got self-righted or when they got righted. I went over to try and right them at one point, and yeah, their geometry upside down was just not the right geometry for me to get a lift in off the lifting geometry I currently have. Again, I do want to change this up because I think I can fix this and make this better, but that is a discussion for an entirely different day. Yeah, it was a lot of the Slasher show though, because they were the one that threw a lot of robots around. They ripped off Nexus's wheel, although I did get a good throw in on Nexus post-wheel rip-off, which I'm quite happy about. Again, not good enough to call this weapon a flipper, but definitely good enough to call it a high-powered lifter, because they are a little bit underweight. Nexus was around about the same weight, actually, as Mistakes were here. But, you know, that was fun. It, again, proves that this mechanism can work and we can do good things with it. And again, I've got plans. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to version 2 of this, especially as we should go back to being a multi-bot for version 2, which that'll be good. Because, I mean, I don't need a self-riding mechanism if my self-riding is having a whole other robot that can just flip me back over again. Maybe. Fingers crossed. Anyway, then we also did get stuck with Slasher. Slasher got their like long lifty prong up in through the anti-saw armor and the anti-hammer armor and just got wedged up in there, so there had to be a release done on that point, which is, you know, that's a thing that happens a lot, especially when you've got long pointy weapons. Speaking of that long pointy weapon, it was very, very annoying because the geometry of the front of his robot made it very, very hard to get any weapon engagement on him at all, especially with that very, very long point out there throwing you around if you got anywhere near him. And then, of course, to round that fight out, he did eventually manage to get us upside down, and as we've seen from the past sets of fights, there is nothing I can do from that point. So, of course, we lost that fight, and of course, Hacksling Slasher won it. But again, I came out of that fight ecstatic. That was a fun fight. There was lots of different things that happened. The robot worked really well. If it wasn't for the fact that I can not self-right, we would have done a really good job there, I think. Yeah, so I was pretty happy with that. And on the whole, the weekend was just good. It was just a good weekend. I had a lot of fun, especially given the amount of effort that it took to get there. It was worth it. It was worth it. I very, very much enjoy the featherweight events. And yeah, this robot proved that it can do things, and that with some slight tweaks and rearrangements, we can definitely have a very, very capable robot on our hands moving into the next event. So yes, anyway, I think that is all I'm going to say. Thank you again to Nick, the table mate, who provided footage, and James for providing footage and also his beta weight. Links to them in the description down below, as mentioned. I hope you guys have enjoyed this one, and I will see you in the next video.